The deadbolt clicked like a gun cocking, and the sound hollowed through my chest. Ethan stood framed in the doorway of the house I built with my own hands, snow curling around his sneakers, eyes hard as winter stone. "Figure it out, Dad. This house isn't yours anymore." Before I could speak, the door slammed. The brass knocker rattled once, then stilled. Wind swept across Chicago's empty street, lifting ice like splinters around my ankles. The porch boards groaned beneath me, familiar yet refusing to hold me now, like an old dog that no longer recognized its owner. My fingers gripped the railing. Snowflakes melted on my skin, slipping away like the years I had poured into this place. Had my own son just erased me, starting his own chapter in this long, bitter family drama? Before you continue, don't forget to subscribe and let me know in the comments where and when you're watching. I turned back toward the street. The windows behind me glowed faintly amber, warm as the light inside a snow globe. Only now I was the one outside, just another figure pressed against the glass, waiting for someone to remember he belonged there. Somewhere in the dark, the furnace hummed. The house was breathing, even if it no longer remembered my name. The first night I slept in my truck, the cab smelled of sawdust and old leather, like the ghost of my workshop still clinging to me. Through the windshield, the house at 217 Willow Street glowed faintly behind frosted glass, warm, distant, touchable. I had spent 40 years building it board by board, paycheck by paycheck. Every porch post carried a scar from my chisel. Every room echoed a different laugh from Ethan's childhood. And yet, with one slammed door, it all belonged to someone else. Rebecca's voice returned to me from years ago, drifting through memory like smoke. "Homes are made of wood, David, but families, they're made of promises." I once promised Ethan he'd never be left behind. He had promised, at 5 years old, that he would always keep my rocking chair, the one I carved for his birthday, by his bed. I wondered if it still sat there, or if he'd dragged it to the curb like another piece of trash from a life he no longer claimed. The chair had become an anchor in my mind. Sturdy oak, sanded smooth, the grain curling like old fingerprints. I had made it to last longer than me, and yet now, even it might be gone. "How does love rot into this?" I whispered, though I wasn't sure who I was asking. Or had it been rotting all along, hidden beneath the paint? I pulled my old flannel tighter. The heater clicked once and died, leaving only the sound of passing cars slicing the cold. My phone buzzed with an overdue mortgage notice, $1,184.16, due by Friday. Ethan had stopped paying the joint account weeks ago while still using my name to funnel the utility bills through. It struck me then, not just the cruelty, but the precision. This wasn't rebellion, it was strategy. A quiet campaign to erase me from my own life. A bitter wind slid through the cracked door seal, and I thought of how deceit always starts like that. Just a thin draft, unnoticed, until the whole house grows cold. What if he never wanted the house? I murmured to the empty dashboard. Just wanted me gone. The question clung to me as dawn broke pale and gray over Chicago, washing the snow in silver. The house stood silent across the street, windows blank, giving nothing away. I started the engine, the old truck coughing awake, and whispered to the steering wheel like an oath. "If he's rewriting our story, I'll make sure I have a pen too." And with that, I pulled away from the curb, not knowing if I was driving toward hope or the opening chapter of a revenge story I never meant to write. The bank's login page blinked at me like a stubborn lock refusing its own key. I typed the familiar numbers, the ones I had used for years, the ones Ethan used to ask me to repeat slowly so he could remember them in case something happened. Incorrect password. Try again. My palms dampened. I tried 2 more times, my fingers trembling, until the screen went flat white. Account locked. I called the customer service line, pressing the phone hard to my ear, as if force could make their voice warmer. After 10 minutes of elevator music, a woman finally answered. Sir, your joint savings account was emptied 2 days ago. Balance now shows $0.02. Emptied, my voice cracked. Yes, full withdrawal. Online transfer to an external account ending in 7831. Do you recognize it? The number was foreign, cold as the snow on my boots. I sat in my truck outside a 24-hour diner on West Belmont Avenue. The neon sign hummed, half its letters burned out, the O flickering like a dying eye. Inside, I took the corner booth, where Ethan and I once shared late-night pancakes after his high school baseball games. He used to stack the syrup cups into towers, grinning when they toppled. Now, my table was scattered with unpaid electric bills and mortgage statements, their ink smudged from the condensation on my coffee mug. "Refill, hun?" the waitress asked gently. "Please," I said, sliding my card across. "And can you run this again?" She returned minutes later, her smile faltering. "I'm sorry," she whispered, setting it down carefully. "It's been declined." The words slid across the table like a blade. She set the card down as if it might break. I thanked her anyway, because shame teaches you strange politeness. Through the diner window, snow flurried under the streetlight. My own reflection looked back at me in the glass. Shoulders sagged, eyes hollow, a man unspooling at the seams. I thought of the 62,000 that had lived in that account, the sum of decades of missed vacations and patched boots, gone now like breath on glass. Did he need the money? Or just need to erase me? I whispered. The coffee tasted like ashes. Around me, people laughed over hash browns and holiday plans, while my world quietly collapsed in a corner booth. This was more than theft. It was the kind of slow disassembling only family knows how to do. Each piece of me removed gently, as if dismantling a house in the dark. Somewhere between the receipts and the ruins of my pride, I felt something else spark. A thin, dangerous thread of resolve. If Ethan was writing me out of his life, I would trace every number he had touched until the truth surfaced. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about surviving the undertow of our family drama long enough to breathe again. The garage door creaked like a reluctant confession as I lifted it halfway, just enough to slip under. The air inside was sharp with the scent of cold metal and oil, the smell of years spent fixing what no one else would touch. My boots scuffed against the concrete floor as I reached the far shelf, where a small wooden chest waited. Dark walnut, brass corners, the lock slightly rusted from too many winters. I had built it myself decades ago, back when Ethan still sat cross-legged on the workbench watching me plane boards as if I were carving the world. My hands shook as I pulled the chest forward. It was heavier in memory than it was in my arms now, and that difference made my stomach lurch. I set it on the old tool table and slipped the key from my wallet, a flat silver thing I had carried behind my driver's license since 1992. The lock clicked. The lid creaked open. Empty. The absence hit harder than any impact could have. No deed to the house. No original mortgage contract. No folder of tax returns. Only a faint outline in the felt lining where the papers had once rested, like ghosts lying in shallow graves. For a long moment, I just stood there, listening to the quiet hum of the chest freezer in the corner, wondering if silence could be complicit. Had he taken even my name from this place? I tried to picture Ethan carrying the box out of here, slipping it into his car while I lay in the hospital recovering from that February surgery. He would have known exactly what he was looking for. He had helped me file those documents once, back when he still called this garage Dad's Kingdom. A kingdom now looted. The thought slashed across my mind like lightning, illuminating every shadow at once. What if this wasn't about rebellion or necessity? What if it was about erasing the evidence that I had ever built anything at all? That kind of precision wasn't born overnight. It belonged to someone quietly rearranging the chessboard while pretending to play checkers. Outside, A snowplow groaned down Willow Street, its yellow lights sweeping across the cracks in the garage floor. I stared at the empty chest, and for the first time, the hollow space inside it felt like a map of my life. Whole sections missing, entire years scooped out clean. If he could take the papers, he could take the title. If he could take the title, he could take the house. And if he could take the house, what was stopping him from taking the story of me? A knot of dread coiled in my chest, but underneath it, something colder flickered awake. This wasn't just a theft. It was a quiet, calculated rewriting, a form of deceit so complete it made truth feel fictional. The snowplow turned the corner and vanished. Darkness folded back over the garage. I closed the empty box, its hollow thud echoing like the sound of dirt on a coffin, and whispered to no one, "He's not done yet." If this story touched something deep inside you, please like and subscribe. Your support keeps these stories alive. Snow still clung to the edge of her navy trench coat when Rebecca Cole stepped into the diner, brushing it off with the kind of precision only lifelong lawyers and watchmakers seem to have. She spotted me hunched over a half-eaten plate of eggs at the corner booth, the one that always wobbled no matter how many sugar packets you stuffed beneath its leg. "You look like you've been sleeping in a truck," she said, sliding into the opposite seat. "I have," I replied, then added, "It's cheaper than a hotel. Doesn't come with mints on the pillow, though." Her lips twitched, the ghost of a smile breaking through. Then she dropped her leather briefcase on the table with a thud that silenced the nearby chatter. The latch clicked open. Inside, wrapped in a clear sleeve, were 3 neatly folded forms. "I think Ethan forged your signature," she said quietly, her voice more scalpel than sound. "These are labeled as supplemental insurance waivers, dated February 14th, the day you were in surgery." The word "forged" hung in the air like second-hand smoke. I reached for the papers, my fingers grazing the sharp edges. There it was. My name, slanted, almost perfect, but not quite. The D curled wrong. Ethan used to trace my signature on scrapwood when he was 8, proud when it looked close. I had laughed then, thinking it was harmless mimicry. "How sure are you?" I asked. 99%, Rebecca replied. "The ink lot code doesn't match the hospital's printer stock. And more importantly, you couldn't have signed anything. Your right hand was still bandaged from the IV site." The waitress appeared, refilled my coffee, and lingered a little too long. Maybe she sensed the air had shifted, that something invisible was bleeding out on this table between the salt shaker and the cracked sugar dispenser. Rebecca leaned in. "If he used these waivers as cover to transfer the deed, we can build a case. But we'll need proof. Timestamps, metadata, anything that shows you weren't even conscious when these were signed." I let out a dry laugh that startled even me. "So, while I was lying half-dead in a hospital gown, my son was busy rewriting my life in pen." "It seems that way." A couple in the next booth laughed at something on a phone screen, and for a brief second I wanted to ask them how it felt to live in a world where betrayal didn't wear your last name. Rebecca tapped the papers gently. "This could be the thread we pull to unravel everything. But we'll have to move carefully. If he realizes we're on to him, he might bury the rest of it." I stared at my fake signature until the lines blurred. It was almost beautiful, how precisely he'd imitated me. Almost beautiful, if it hadn't been the opening verse to a symphony of deceit. "All right," I said, sliding the papers back across the table. "Let's see how deep this goes." Marcus Hale arrived like a shadow pretending to be a man. Quiet, compact, wearing the kind of charcoal coat that absorbed light instead of reflecting it. Rebecca had insisted on bringing him in, saying I needed eyes that knew where people liked to hide things. He ordered nothing at the diner, just pushed aside my half-eaten toast to open a slim black laptop, its screen glowing cold against the cracked formica. He worked in silence, fingers gliding over the keys as if playing a piano only he could hear. I watched him, wondering how many family implosions he'd witnessed from behind that calm face. After 10 minutes, he turned the screen toward me. "Your son's email server is sloppy," he said, voice flat, almost bored. "He uses the same weak password for everything, like most people who think they're clever." Lines of text filled the screen, sent folders, draft chains, attachments. Then one subject line caught me like a hook through the ribs. "Finalize deed transfer this week." The message was dated 3 nights ago. Ethan had written it to someone named M. Vargas, a name I had never heard, asking them to ensure all filings are complete by Thursday before Dad notices. My throat felt full of sand. "He actually wrote it down," I muttered. Marcus leaned back, folding his hands. "Arrogance leaves fingerprints. You just have to know where to dust." Something between a laugh and a growl escaped me. "When did families start needing private investigators?" "About 5 minutes after they started lying to each other," he said, not smiling. Rebecca slid into the booth, having just returned from making a call. She scanned the screen, her jaw tightening. "If we can match this to the forged insurance waivers, we can prove intent. But we need a time-stamped access log, something admissible." Marcus nodded. "Already scraping the metadata. If we time this right, we'll catch him mid-transfer. Banks leave trails even when people think they don't." It struck me how surreal this had become. Just weeks ago, I had been sanding a cedar shelf in my garage, listening to an old baseball game on the radio, believing my life was small but solid. Now I was sitting in a booth on West Belmont Avenue, plotting a sting operation against my own son. I stared at Ethan's name glowing on the screen. It felt like looking at my last name printed on someone else's tombstone. If this was going to be the story of my undoing, then I wanted to at least choose the ending. The thought curled inside me like smoke, dark and stubborn. This wouldn't just be about stopping him anymore. It was becoming something closer to survival. A slow, bitter metamorphosis toward the kind of resolve that grows in the shadows of revenge stories. Marcus's laptop hummed softly on the diner table, its glow casting pale light over the half-drunk coffees and a scattering of receipts like fallen leaves. Outside, West Belmont Avenue was slick with melting snow, the plows gone, the streets emptied to a silence that felt like held breath. Rebecca sat across from me, arms folded, watching Marcus the way one watches a surgeon, quietly, anxiously, as if any sudden move might sever something vital. "There," Marcus murmured. His fingertips circled a corner of the screen. "This is the metadata from the deed transfer forms Ethan filed. Look at the signature fields." I leaned closer. Even through the screen, the strokes looked too perfect, like something printed rather than written. He tapped a few keys and split the screen, showing my actual signature from a 2019 tax return. "Yours has micro-pressure variants," he said. "These don't. They were scanned images dropped into a PDF. Whoever did it used an editing suite to overlay them. It's like cutting your name out of your life and pasting it onto theirs." Rebecca's voice was steady, but her jaw tightened. "He didn't just steal your house, David. He tried to erase you from the records, as if you'd never owned anything at all." The words struck me like ice water. I remembered Ethan as a boy, sprawled on the garage floor, drawing castles on scrap plywood with a dull pencil, declaring that one day he'd build real ones. And now here he was, tearing mine down, except not with hammers or bulldozers, but with lines of code and legal filings, the new weapons of inheritance wars. "Timestamps are falsified too," Marcus added. "They were backdated 3 weeks using a local script. Sloppy work, honestly." A humorless laugh slipped from my mouth before I could stop it. "Well, if you're going to dismantle your father's life, you should at least do a professional job." Rebecca shot me a sharp look, but her eyes softened. "Sarcasm's fine," she said. "Just don't let it distract you from how dangerous this is. This is calculated deceit, David. and the courts don't take kindly to ghosts signing legal documents. I stared at my forged signature glowing from the screen, an imposter in my own handwriting. The air in the diner felt thin, brittle. Somewhere above us, the ceiling fan spun slowly, slicing time into quiet fragments. There was a strange kind of grief in it, not just for the theft, but for the precision. The realization that my son hadn't acted out of chaos, but out of order, like someone cleaning a desk before pushing the owner out of the chair. Marcus closed the laptop and slipped it into his bag with clinical finality. We have enough to prove fraud. Not yet enough to win. But close. Very close. Rebecca nodded once. Then let's make sure he doesn't see us coming. Morton's The Steakhouse still smelled like old money and seared ribeye. The kind of place where waiters glided instead of walked and whispered like they were carrying state secrets. I had reserved a booth in the back, near the frosted glass wall, far enough from the bar chatter that words could fall like stones without drawing eyes. Ethan arrived 10 minutes late. Crisp navy suit, hair slicked with the kind of precision that comes from believing the world belongs to you. He slid into the booth without a word, checked his phone, and set it face down on the table, as if even that deserved to be obeyed. I studied him, the cut of his jaw, the confidence in the way he waved for a drink. It startled me how much he looked like me at 33, except sharper, colder, like a photo printed on metal. I wanted to see your face, I said, when you explained why you've been dismantling my life. He smiled faintly, the kind of smile you give a street performer who drops the ball. Always dramatic, Dad. It's just real estate, not the end of the world. Not the end of the world, I echoed. Just the house I built board by board while you were sleeping upstairs. Just the savings account that was supposed to pay off the mortgage in December. Just my name carved off the deed like mold. He reached for the bread basket, tore a piece in half, and said it as casually as if we were discussing the weather. You were never going to leave. And I need the house as collateral. It's worth nearly $280,000, and I have investors lined up. You don't need it, I do. Something in me went very still. It wasn't rage, not yet. More like standing on a frozen lake and hearing the first crack form underfoot. You didn't ask, I said softly. You just decided I was finished. You are, he said, still chewing. You just don't know it. For a moment, the clink of glasses and the low jazz from the ceiling speakers blurred into static. He talked about interest rates, venture capital, renovation budgets, as if this were a business pitch and I was a stubborn obstacle instead of the man who taught him to tie his shoes. And then I saw it, the thing beneath the ambition. Fear. A flicker. Gone as soon as it came. But there. The way his eyes darted when he said investors. Like someone already in too deep, building ladders out of stolen wood. I leaned forward, my voice low enough to disappear under the music. What happens when they find out the collateral isn't yours to give? He met my gaze and smiled like a man who has memorized his own lies. They won't. He stood, tossed his linen napkin onto the table, and buttoned his jacket. Enjoy dinner, Dad. I've got meetings. As he walked away, the waiter returned with 2 steaks. One sat untouched, bleeding quietly onto the porcelain. I stared at the empty space across from me, and wondered how many people had to applaud your ambition before it stopped sounding like betrayal. In that cavernous restaurant full of strangers and soft laughter, I realized something hollow but sharp had begun to grow in me. Not hatred, not even grief. Just a cold clarity, the kind that starts revenge stories without meaning to. If this story stayed with you for a moment, support us by liking and subscribing. Every click helps us tell the next one. The sky over Chicago had gone the color of wet slate, clouds sagging low as if the city were holding its breath. Marcus stood beside my battered pickup in the alley behind my old house, his gloved hands moving with surgical precision as he tucked the recorder beneath the rusted lip of the mailbox. The tiny red light blinked once, then disappeared under a strip of black electrical tape. "Motion activated," he said, stepping back. 72 hours of storage. No one will see it unless they're looking for ghosts. I stared at the crooked mailbox like it was an altar. Once, Ethan used to wait there after school, swinging his legs as I pulled into the driveway, waving his crumpled drawings at me through the windshield. Now I was using it as a trap. The thought left a bitter taste, like chewing on a nail. Rebecca's voice crackled through my phone speaker. "He's been in and out all week. If he's moving documents or meeting someone about the house, this will catch him. Just make sure he doesn't see you anywhere nearby." "Trust me," I said, eyes fixed on the mailbox. "If he wants to bury me, I'll let him dig his own grave first." The wind cut down Willow Street like a knife, rattling the bare branches that scraped against my old bedroom window. Through the curtain gap, I could see the faint blue glow of Ethan's laptop on the desk, where I once helped him build a model volcano. Now that same desk was probably covered in forged contracts and investor agreements, the new toys of adulthood. Marcus adjusted the collar of his coat. "We'll monitor from the diner on Belmont. I've routed the feed through a secure line. If he opens that box, we'll know what he takes." Something about the efficiency in his tone almost made me laugh. I had spent decades sanding splinters off wood so Ethan wouldn't cut his fingers, and now I was orchestrating surveillance operations like a man in a bad thriller. Life has a way of turning into the stories you swore you'd never be part of. The first raindrops hit as we left, fat and cold, drumming against the metal roof of my truck. Marcus drove in silence, eyes steady on the wipers, slicing the world into gray ribbons. I sat beside him and watched the water smear the edges of my old house in the rearview mirror until it looked less like a home and more like a watercolor someone had started and abandoned halfway through. It occurred to me, not for the first time, that family drama isn't loud when it's real. It's quiet. It creeps. It builds like a storm front, silent until the sky splits. As we turned onto West Belmont Avenue, the rain thickened, hammering the windshield. Marcus glanced at me. "When this works," he said, "what do you want to do to him?" I kept my eyes on the blurred city lights ahead. "I don't know," I admitted. "But I do know this, he won't see it coming." The diner smelled of burnt coffee and rain-soaked wool when Marcus slid into the booth, his coat dripping a dark halo onto the floor. He opened his laptop without a word, the screen lighting his face like a campfire in some grim bedtime story. Rebecca was already beside me, leaning forward, eyes sharpened to a point. "Got something," Marcus said, voice low enough that even the sugar packets seemed to lean in. He hit play. Ethan's voice crackled through the speakers, bright and careless, the tone he used when he thought the world existed to applaud him. He signed without reading. The old man had no clue. The house is practically mine already. My stomach clenched, but Rebecca smiled, just barely, like a cat seeing a mouse trip over its own tail. "That," she said, "is a confession. People go to court over weaker sentences than that." On the recording, Ethan laughed, a hollow sound that didn't belong to the boy I raised. He was talking to someone named Vargas, the same name from the email. "Once it's filed, he's irrelevant. He won't even know until I'm living there, and he's..." The line broke into static as if the universe had the decency to censor what came next. I wanted to fling the laptop across the room, but instead I stirred my cold coffee, watching the spoon spin like a tiny silver planet circling nothing. "He said it like I was furniture," I murmured. "Like he's just rearranging me." "Then we'll make him trip on the rug," Marcus said. His tone was dry enough to spark. Rebecca snapped a photo of the waveform on the screen. "Chain of custody starts now. From this moment, everything we collect goes through legal protocol. No surprises, no leaks." A family at the next table was cutting into pancakes, syrup dripping like amber. The father was wiping his daughter's face with a napkin, smiling as she protested. It hit me, absurdly, that Ethan used to do the same at this very booth, except back then he'd just grin through the mess and say, "I'm saving it for later." I turned back to the laptop, to the voice that no longer sounded like my son, and thought how betrayal rarely shouts. It whispers, smooth and soft, until you find yourself standing in ruins wondering when the house caught fire. Rebecca touched my arm gently. "We're closer than he thinks. Don't flinch now." I nodded, not sure if the movement was agreement or just gravity. Somewhere beneath the anger, something else flickered. A grim, reluctant patience. The kind of patience that builds the skeleton of a revenge story without meaning to. Snow fell in slow spirals outside the Cook County Courthouse, each flake dissolving on the black granite steps, before anyone could notice it had ever been whole. Rebecca stood next to me, her coat drawn tight, a thin folder clutched under her arm like something alive. Inside it were my original deed, the bank statements Marcus had dug out of Ethan's digital closet, and the recording where my son had laughed about my stupidity like it was a party trick. "We have the deed, the recording, and the financial logs," she said, her voice steady as a courtroom gavel. "He's finished." My hands trembled, not from the cold, but from the sheer unfamiliar weight of hope. I had almost forgotten what it felt like, how it burned a little, like blood returning to a limb you thought was gone. I stared up at the marble columns, their fluted edges rimmed with frost, and thought how absurd it was that my whole life had come down to this building, this place where strangers in robes would decide if I still existed on paper. Marcus joined us on the steps, holding a thermos. "They've scheduled the preliminary hearing for 10 o'clock. Judge Helen Pratt will preside. She's known for hating theatrics, so don't give her any." "I was a carpenter for 40 years, I said, my breath misting in the air. "Theatrical's never really been my brand." He smirked faintly. "Good, keep it that way." Rebecca slipped her arm through mine, just for a second, and it startled me how human that small gesture felt. "Listen carefully," she said. "If she sees even a flicker of doubt, she might delay this. We need her to believe you've been standing on solid ground this whole time, even while it was crumbling." I nodded, though part of me wanted to laugh at the irony. "Pretend you're stable while proving you've been dismantled." That sounded like the unofficial motto of this entire family drama. A city bus roared past, spraying slush across the curb. I watched it disappear into the gray distance and wondered what Ethan was doing at this exact moment. Was he sipping espresso in some polished conference room, convincing his investors the house was his to offer? Was he picturing me gone already, a ghost erased from the blueprints? The courthouse doors opened, releasing a gust of warm air tinged with printer toner and floor polish. Rebecca glanced at me, her eyes sharp now, the softness tucked away. "It's time," she said, and for the first time in months I believed her. The courtroom smelled faintly of varnish and old paper, the kind of scent that clings to places where lives are routinely dismantled and reassembled under oath. Judge Helen Pratt sat high behind the bench, black robes pooling around her like dark water, glasses perched at the end of her nose. She regarded us not like people, but like puzzles, pieces to be examined, rearranged, and solved. Rebecca rose first, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. "Your Honor, this case concerns the unlawful transfer of property belonging to my client, Mr. David Mitchell, via forged signatures and fraudulent financial activity." Ethan was already seated at the defense table, legs crossed, wearing a gray suit that looked more expensive than anything I had ever owned. He didn't glance at me, just straightened his cufflinks as though this were a tedious meeting he meant to finish before lunch. Judge Pratt's gaze shifted to me. "Mr. Mitchell, did you voluntarily transfer ownership of your property to your son?" The air in my lungs felt like cold glass. "No, Your Honor. My son forged my trust and my signature while I was recovering from surgery." The courtroom went still. like someone had drawn a curtain across the world. The only sound was the distant hum of the radiator under the window. Rebecca placed the original deed on the evidence table with care, as if laying down a fragile relic. Marcus, seated behind us, opened his laptop, the screen ready to display Ethan's emails and the recording we had played so many times that I could recite it in my sleep. Ethan finally looked at me, his smile polite and hollow. He signed everything. He just doesn't remember. Rebecca's reply was silk wrapped around steel. He couldn't have signed anything. His dominant hand was in a cast. We have medical records time-stamped and notarized. The judge raised an eyebrow, then gestured toward Marcus. He cued the audio, and Ethan's voice spilled through the speakers, careless and triumphant. He signed without reading. The old man had no clue. The house is practically mine already. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Ethan's attorney shifted uncomfortably. Even the court reporter paused, fingers hovering above her keys, as though they had forgotten how to move. Judge Pratt leaned back, her face unreadable. "We will examine all evidence before rendering judgment," she said, though her tone carried the faint edge of disbelief. I stared at the polished wood of the witness stand, seeing not its sheen, but the reflection of all the years I had poured into something now dangling over an abyss. This wasn't just about proving I owned a house. It was about proving I still existed to the people who were supposed to know me best. And what terrified me most was wondering if winning would even change that. Beneath the legal jargon and controlled silence, the truth hissed like steam from a cracked pipe. This wasn't just litigation. It was the raw heart of family drama being paraded under fluorescent lights. If this journey stirred your heart, leave a like and subscribe. It's the fuel that lets us keep creating more. The recording ended with a sharp click that seemed to echo longer than it should have, hanging in the courtroom air like the smell of ozone after lightning. Ethan sat frozen at the defense table, shoulders hunched, color drained from his face until he matched the gray of his tailored suit. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then his knees buckled just enough that the chair caught him on his way down. Judge Helen Pratt peered at him over her glasses. "Mr. Mitchell, is there anything you'd like to clarify?" He opened his mouth, then closed it, jaw working as though words had become splinters. When he finally spoke, his voice was stripped of its polish, quiet and raw enough to sound like truth, or at least the version people reach for when all the lies have burned away. "I just wanted something of my own," he said. It landed with a dull thud, a confession trying to disguise itself as an excuse. A ripple went through the gallery, journalists shifting in their seats, the bailiff glancing at me as if to check I hadn't turned to stone. Rebecca stayed still, eyes sharp and unreadable, but I felt her heel press lightly against my boot under the table. A wordless stay steady. I thought of the house on Willow Street, its oak beams darkened with age, the floorboards creaking in the pattern of our lives. I thought of Ethan at 5, running through the hallway with marker on his hands, declaring he was going to build something bigger than this place. I had believed him then. I almost believed him now, except what he had built was this: an empire of paper and signatures balanced on the hollowed-out ribs of our history. A corner of me wanted to laugh, a brittle, black-edged laugh that would echo too loud under the vaulted ceiling. The court reporter's keys clicked like rain on glass as she transcribed my son's undoing in real time. "I worked for you," Ethan said suddenly, voice rising. "While you were out sanding birdhouses and drinking diner coffee, I was trying to make sure we weren't left behind. You think investors care about your rocking chair or the smell of sawdust? They care about numbers. They care about people who move." Rebecca rose slowly, calm as a tide. "And you decided the best way to move forward was to erase the man who carried you here." The words cut sharper than anything I could have said. Ethan flinched. Not dramatically, just enough that it told the truth. The silence that followed was cavernous. For the first time since this began, I felt the scales tilt. Not fully, not yet, but enough to see that gravity still worked, even in a world this warped. What startled me most was how small he looked now, folded into that chair like a boy at the principal's office, not the man who had tried to rewrite the world around him. And beneath the sting of betrayal, something colder stirred. Pity, the last emotion I had expected to survive the fire. But maybe that's how these things end. Not with triumph, not with vengeance, but with the quiet collapse of someone you used to love, and the unbearable knowledge that winning doesn't bring them back. This wasn't just a case anymore. It was the slow unspooling of a bond. The point in every revenge story where you realize the cost isn't measured in verdicts, but in the people who disappear, even while they're still breathing. Snow was still falling outside the Cook County Courthouse, soft and soundless, as though the world were trying to hush what was about to be said. Judge Helen Pratt adjusted her glasses, her expression carved from stone. She looked from Rebecca to Ethan, then down at the stack of documents before her. The deed, the forged waivers, the bank logs, the recording where my son's laughter had become a knife. "This court finds the property transfer null and void," she said, each word dropping like a gavel in miniature. "Furthermore, evidence indicates deliberate falsification of legal documents and misappropriation of funds. A formal investigation into Mr. Ethan Mitchell for fraud will commence immediately." A collective breath seemed to escape the room, though none of us exhaled. Rebecca straightened slightly, her hand still resting on the table, as if anchoring herself to the earth. The judge's gaze settled on Ethan. "Family is not a license for theft," she said. And the quiet that followed was so sharp it could have drawn blood. Ethan stared at the floor, shoulders bowed under a weight no verdict could quantify. For once, he didn't reach for an argument or a grin. He simply sat there, stripped of momentum, like a toppled statue. I hadn't realized my hands were gripping the edge of the table until the wood creaked under my palms. Not from triumph, something closer to release, like the splintering of a dam you stopped believing would ever break. Snow whirled past the courtroom windows, each flake vanishing the moment it touched the glass. I wondered if victory was supposed to feel louder than this, or if all justice really does is leave you standing in the silence after the shouting stops. Marcus placed a steadying hand on my shoulder. Rebecca whispered, "It's over." But watching my son fold inward, I wasn't sure she was right. Because in family drama, nothing ends cleanly. Things just stop pretending to be whole. The house on Willow Street stood silent as I pulled into the driveway, its windows glowing faintly through the drifting snow, like eyes half closed in reluctant recognition. My key stuck halfway in the lock, as if even the door needed a moment to remember me. When it finally turned, the sound was soft, almost apologetic. The warmth hit first. The old furnace rumbled to life like a faithful dog hearing its master's steps again, and the smell of dry heat rose from the vents. Dust, pine from the floorboards, a hint of ash from the last fire Ethan had built. I closed the door behind me and just stood in the foyer, listening to the house breathe, like I was afraid if I moved too quickly it might disappear. The rocking chair sat in the corner of the living room, exactly where I had left it. Its oak arms caught the glow from the fireplace like something carved from sunlight. I ran my hand along the curve of the wood, half expecting it to crumble after everything. Instead, it held firm beneath my fingers, warm from the fire, as though it had been waiting. I sank into it and stared at the flames. They crackled and snapped, cheerful and ruthless all at once. Somewhere upstairs, the floor creaked as the house shifted in the cold, a sound I had once thought of as comforting, now more like a reminder that even things meant to last still settle under pressure. Rebecca had offered to come by, to make sure it felt real, but I told her no. Marcus had texted, "Congratulations. Justice served." I hadn't answered. Because the truth was, sitting here with the title back in my name, the mortgage reinstated, and my bank account slowly being unfrozen, I didn't feel victorious. I felt intact. Like a ship dragged off the rocks, not yet sure if it could sail again. The fire popped, sending a tiny ember skittering across the hearth, and I found myself laughing quietly. Maybe this was what winning looked like in the ruins of family drama. Not champagne or cheers, just a man in a chair he built decades ago, trying to remember if home was supposed to feel this quiet. Is this victory? I whispered to the empty room. Or just survival wearing its best suit? The stair rail was colder than I remembered. I crouched on the landing, pressing a fresh dowel into the splintered wood where Ethan's heel had cracked it months ago. The old varnish had dulled to the color of tea-stained bone. With every turn of the screwdriver, the sound echoed faintly through the empty house, like the tick of a clock reminding me how long it had been broken. Rebecca stood at the bottom of the stairs, hands in the pockets of her navy coat, watching with an expression halfway between concern and something gentler. "So," she said, her voice softer than I'd ever heard it in a courtroom. "What will you do now?" I tightened the last screw and set the screwdriver down, its metal ringing lightly against the step. "Teach again," I said, but not with wood this time. Outside, snow drifted across the yard in lazy spirals, covering the old tire marks from the day the sheriff locked Ethan out. The house felt heavier without him, but also steadier, like a ship after a storm. Its sails torn, its deck cracked but upright. Still here. For the first time in months, my phone buzzed without dread. A message from Ethan. "I'm in Boston. Trying to start over. I'll call when I can say something worth saying." The words glowed against the screen like embers refusing to go out. I didn't reply. Not yet. Some wounds need silence before they can risk words again. I looked around the house, at the staircase now whole, the rocking chair waiting by the fire, and thought of all the years I'd spent trying to build permanence out of things that were never meant to last. Maybe love isn't about building something that endures. Maybe it's about choosing to rebuild when everything says you shouldn't. Because in the end, even the sharpest revenge story fades. What stays are the hands willing to start again. The fire cracked in the hearth, warm and steady. "Does love survive?" I whispered to the quiet room. "When trust has turned to ash?" If you enjoyed this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts about it in the comments. Thank you for spending this time with me. May you be safe, healthy, and held close by those who matter. And when you're ready, join me next time, where we'll step deeper into the hidden scars that families carry and what it takes to finally lay them down.